Okay, we are live and hopefully we won't have any trouble with the recording. Okay, so hey everybody. So I'm doing Sunday school today and oh, my pronouns are she, her, they, them. My name is Leanne. Okay. Anyway, so see what happens when we do things right, okay? Or not right. Anyway, I always go on the premise it's Facebook and most of the people who follow on Facebook know who I am. Um, Anyway, I'm Leanne, pronoun she, her. I'm doing Metanoia Sunday School today. And today our message is this the end of the world as we know it? So this is actually a study that is kind of a companion piece to my earlier podcast called The Last Days Part 28, the sequel, which I have to say Nick gave me the title for. That was a little bit more of the history of the end of the world as we understand it in modern times. This is a little bit more of the result or the product of it or the way that people kind of think about things through an apocalyptic lens because of end times hype and theory. And what I'm going to kind of talk about in here, this is actually going to parallel one I did a long time ago, which was about the time of the end and the words, and we are going to talk about what the different words mean. This is not a Sunday school where we're going to go to 4,000 Bible verses and I'm going to prove everything I have to say like that. This is more of a survey of culture and of where we're at. So to start off, which we did not air because of copyright reasons, we showed the music video that is the inspirational title for this and it's The End of the World as We Know It and I Feel Fine by REM. Now, for those who don't know what the song and the video are about, one of the members fell asleep watching TV one night and he woke up and the news was on. And the flow that the song has is to relate to stream of consciousness. That, in other words, we are inundated with information and material and things all the time. And now, this song that I'm mentioning was written in like 1989. So, can you imagine what it's like now? Okay, that was, in other words, they were inundated with information and overwhelmed with stuff and news broadcasts in 1989. Can you imagine what it is now? And some of the references that are in the song, I'm going to venture generationally have phased out. Like one of them in particular that I took note that they mentioned is Lenny Bruce. Now, I don't know if you guys even know who Lenny Bruce was. Now, Lenny Bruce is also mentioned in La Vie Boheme in Rent because Lenny Bruce was a comedian, just for the sake of this, who was raunchy and filthy and vulgar in the 50s and the 60s. And he kept getting arrested on obscenity laws. And what he did, if we're going to talk about for the sake of history and where we are today, I mean, he wasn't anything compared to maybe Richard Pryor or some of these later guys. But what he did was very, very important for free speech. And so they mentioned Leonard Bernstein. There's a lot of people in that stream of consciousness from the earlier eras that you probably would not recognize today. But the concept is still there. And then when they made the video, and this is something that I've talked about when I talk about the 90s, because I think the video came out in 1990. It was like one of the number one videos for 1990. This is when MTV was still a lot newer than it is now. This is before it got taken over by maternity TV, which is what everybody says MTV stands for now, because all they do is have I'm 16 and pregnant, or I'm a teen mom, or whatever. So this is way before that. This is when MTV was actually cool, when people would actually pretend to be sick to stay home to watch MTV because somebody's video was coming out. Music was actually on the cusp of change between the rise of I guess more or less the fall of heavy metal and the rise of alternative and grunge, which REM was in there. REM would be considered alternative rock. And kind of quirky in some of their songs and kind of different, but a lot of it has a lot of meaning. The video is supposed to be the boy as the survivor after the big one hit, whether it was the big bomb or nuclear holocaust or whatever. That boy standing there doing his thing, going through pictures, going through Apollo stuff, playing with his dog in a broken down house is the survivor after whatever the cataclysm was came. And at that time, I'm going to say it was probably nuclear because that was a thing of the time. That was the big fear was the Cold War was about to fall, the Berlin Wall was about to come down, but everybody was still kind of in that panic mode. So the reason I think that actually that's an interesting video to open with, even though, looks like it's okay, even though it was, such a long time ago, and history really has changed a lot. In some ways, history repeats itself, as we've learned from church history. Distant, far away church history is repeating itself right now. And that not so distant history is repeating itself now. So what we're going to look at is we're going to understand how the panic over the end of civilization is hurting our witness, and it's actually hurting our understanding in our faith and the way that we kind of look at it, because it's basically created what I'm going to call a moral panic. And the moral panic is not necessarily morality in one specified sense. So whenever everybody talks about morality, everybody always thinks that you're talking about sex, or you're talking about living together and not being married, or you're talking about being gay. That's not the level that I'm talking about on. I'm saying that everybody's kind of defined their own moral panic, and everybody has their own moral agenda, and everybody is pushing their own perspective of whatever that means. But is that really the way that we're supposed to understand the time of the end, or the end of the world, or the way that we're kind of conceiving it? So let's talk a little bit about the idea of constant moral panic. Can anything save us? And this goes back to what we've talked about when we're looking over different prophets. And there's this line in one of them, I don't remember if it was Jeremiah or Isaiah, but it clearly says, can Assyria save us? I'm going to say it was probably Isaiah, because the southern kingdom fell under Jeremiah, so I'm going to say it was Isaiah, but it says, can Assyria save us? And I think that that's a question we need to ask ourselves, because we're very, very comfortable, I guess we could say, with the idea that something is going to come along and save our civilization, our nation, our whatever, from what might in some ways be inevitable. And instead of doing, based on some articles that I'm going to get to that you sent me, instead of looking at how to survive it or how to move through it, everybody's answer is to stop all the processes. They want some messianic figure, whether it's a political leader, whether it's a party, whether it's a job, whether it's anything listed in your idols list under progressive Christianity, whether it's government, whether it's Trump, whether it's Kamala Harris, whether it's anybody, anything. We're just kind of hoping that something is going to halt things and save them from being worse. But is this how this works? So how did this message come into being? Or, this Sunday school, where did I get the idea for this? So this is where I got the idea for this. So I recently received the following email in response to my Patheos column, 8 Christian Thoughts for the Election Season. Now, I have blocked out the names because that's what we're supposed to do. But this is what it said. Your recent publication reprinted. It wasn't reprinted. It's only in Patheos. Patheos doesn't like reprinted material, so that was not correct. In Patheos asserted that, contrary to what might be a popular opinion, the fate of the entire world does not rest on this upcoming election is clearly wrong.
Solid start.
Exactly, a run-on sentence. So, Trump and the climate-denying business leaders who support fossil fuel use are destroying the balance of nature. The future of the world as God made it is in jeopardy, and poor people all across the world face the disastrous effects of drought, storms, famine, and flooding. I appeal to you to change your teaching. We are to be caretakers or the earth. It's supposed to be of the earth, and he capitalized earth, which that is not grammatically correct there. It doesn't need to be capitalized there. And all of the English majors in the room are nodding. Not raping it for our own short-term pleasure. Now,
I'm sorry. Not what?
not raping it for our own short-term pleasure. Now, we could discuss, I have a whole problem with that definition of rape.
That's why I was like, did I get it?
So, But that's a wonderful thing that you pointed out there. It's not a wonderful thing, but it's a wonderful thing that you pointed that out, because think about what we're talking about today. Okay? Now we're going to read what I actually said, and then we're going to discuss it. So this is what I actually said. So no matter who wins, it's not the end of the world. That's the subheading. Politicians would like us to believe that the winners of the 2024 election will either redeem or destroy this world. In religious language, voting for one party over another is spoken of in apocalyptic terminology. If one doesn't vote for that specific party, or better yet, decides to sit this one out altogether, civilization as we know it will end. Contrary to what might be a popular opinion, the fate of the entire world does not rest on this upcoming election. Life, in one form or another, will continue on November 6th, 2024, and January 20th, 2025, that being the day after the inauguration. We still have lives to lead, faith to embrace, and spiritual values to represent. Perspective is essential. That's what I said. Now, what do we hear in this exchange? Now, the reason why this is important is because I'm going to venture, based on his cause, that was not somebody, and that he's not a Trump supporter, that's not somebody who probably is a dispensationalist. He's probably not somebody who thinks that Jesus is coming at any moment and the rapture's about to occur and that we have to, get ready because the whole world is going to go to hell and the Antichrist is coming. He's probably not somebody who accepts that narration of theology. But he is still accepting apocalypticism. It's just in a different form. It's just in a more progressive form. So instead of seeing the world as ending because of gay people, or because of, which is ridiculous, or because of people living together and not being married, or because of people showing their behinds on television, or cussing on the internet, or whatever, or that AI is going to take over. He may not accept any of those narratives, but he still has a moral-induced panic. And his moral-induced panic in this particular interest is over climate change, is over the fact that he feels that the environment is the number one priority. Now, we talk all the time about single interest voters and single issue voters with abortion, or with the death penalty, or with things of that nature. But apparently there are single issue voters in other areas that don't get any attention because maybe they don't yell the loudest, or maybe they only arise when something is said. But his entire platform is climate change. He's not considering the economy. He's not, he really thinks that whoever gets in office is going to determine the fate of the world, which, I mean, my God, that the entire fate of the world rests on one of two people, right?
Including Antarctica?
Including Antarctica,
Oh,
And I'm looking at my mom for that for a reason, and you all are going to know why with the next slide, that the entire fate of the world rests on two people. That's an awful lot of power to give to two people. So listen to this. What do we hear in the exchange? And I did not answer this man, although I thought about it, and yes, it's a man. We all know it was a man. So what do you hear in it? So there's a fear of impending doom, something apocalyptic, or something that we understand to be apocalyptic, meaning surrounding the end of the world. The word apocalyptic doesn't actually mean the end of the world. It means hidden, unveiling. That, in other words, something that was not seen has now been seen through a revelation. But we're using the term apocalyptic like they use it in movies and TV, and that there's an entire hype around this. So like we say, even though he wasn't a dispensationalist, he had the same urgency, hostility, and impending doom of somebody who was. So in other words, he's anticipating if this doesn't go the way that he thinks it ought to go, that everybody's done. So his narrowness for cause impacts his ability for contact and perspective, particularly when it comes to processing information. Now, we have talked a lot about this, about people not really being very literate when it comes to reading information. And I can say, having done trainings with modules all week. If you are not literary savvy, you miss a lot of things. I'm going to tell you, I have done a thing and it's for the government all week, and I actually found typos a couple of times. That's because people are not literary savvy. They're not paying attention to context. They're not actually reading words that are put up. They're just kind of generally there. And we talk a lot about active versus passive listening, or that we don't know how to listen to other people. But it is just as relevant that we don't know how to process information that is in print or that is in front of us. And we don't, because when we go into that article, we're reading a bias. He already didn't like my article. And he got down to that point where he could finally interject his opinion, and he interjected it, even though he took it totally out of context. You know what? This is the fact. Whether it's in November, whether it's in January, whether it's not for 5,000 years from now, something with the Earth is going to change. And as we know from history, climate change is a thing, which we will talk about in a little bit. But there is also a sense that the entire future of the world hinges on one specific thing or a series of things. So the belief that an earthly political leader has the ability to save all of humanity. I mean, that's really kind of scary. I mean, if you think about it, anybody who sees the issue differently is clearly wrong. In other words, there is no other way to see this issue except through their perspective and except through their lens. And everybody else who isn't seeing it is clearly wrong. And then there's this sense of impending urgency and doom at the same time. So we have to act now, or this is going to happen. And the point is that everybody in this culture, to a certain extent, has this thinking. And much like I've said, everybody in this country is Baptist, no matter what denomination they go to, just simply because that's the American religion and it influences American thinking and American politics and the American way of life. Apocalypticism has also become a part of American view. It's become a part of the way that America views the world. And if you look at history, and there is a book on the history of the end of the world, it's called Apocalypse, The History of the End of the World. It's by, I believe, John Talbot is his name. I have it upstairs if anybody wants to see it. The book actually really kind of points out that whereas the rest of the world kind of moved on from all this stuff, for some reason, Americans tend to hold on to these ideas far long after the rest of the world has let them go. So the idea of impending apocalypse has not really been a belief in Europe in a very long time. But in America, it's like they just dug their heels in and they kind of went with it. And there's a lot of other reasons for that. So when I was kind of doing this and when I got the email and I was trying to think about what to put together, the things that I was talking about reminded me of something else. And this is what it reminded me of. So now, the actual nice tie-in is that the music video that we looked at is from the same era. It's actually from maybe a year or two later. So, this is what this reminded me of. So, a very long time ago, in the place where we lived, they used to have this street talk, and they would stop people on the street, and they would ask them what they thought about current events. And this was at the time of the Reykjavik Summit. There were a series of different summits during the Cold War in the 80s that we never talk about at school that were to disarm Russia and the United States and try and cease tensions. And so this is Gorbachev. I think it's Gorbachev. If it's not Gorbachev, nobody's going to care. No, and Reagan.
Oh, Reagan.
This is Gorbachev and this is Reagan. And so we can just kind of see everybody's comments. And if you look at some of their comments, they're interesting. But then we have down here, this is my mother. And I want you to know I found this in a photo album. And her comment was, I think this time that it might possibly help. So they had a series of these. But it bothers me that the fate of the entire world depends on two men. And that was... They don't give the... Oh, do you think that summit talks help any in solving world problems? It's a stupid question anyway. Kind of, yeah, only with politics, yeah. And it really didn't do anything. I mean, the Soviet governments, the Soviet Union kind of fell on its own. It didn't have anything to do with these talks. But that's the perspective that really gives me, is that I'm sitting here going, the fate of the world does not rest on one person or two people or a government or any of this stuff. And like I remember Mama saying after we lived through Trump almost sending us to war with North Korea, the only reason we're all still here is because of God. I mean, if that doesn't prove that there's something greater, then all these things keep happening historically and we're all still here. If that doesn't prove that there's God, nothing else does. Hmm?
They have pigs.
They have pigs.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I remember that.
Yeah. My dad was in the military then, and they had them on standby. And according to what you had said, he didn't come home, and one of your friends said, go turn on the TV and to find out what was going on. And he came back and he said that they had men, they were flying up there in circles. The men were throwing up because no one was clear about what they were supposed to be doing or what was going to happen. But what this kind of tells us, and what I'm going to go for with this, and we're going to actually talk about the 90s again in a little bit. What does this tell us? Well, the idea that the government can save us is not a new idea. Okay? And it's not new. If we even go back to the Bible, Assyria is going to save us. No, they're not. Okay? Just get over it. All right? And so the idea of apocalypticism is very flexible and it affects many different theological viewpoints. If you study religion in any kind of context in depth, and this is something that interests you, there are apocalyptic alien cults. There are all sorts of different theological premises about the end of the world. There is a certain level of apocalypticism in Native American culture. Now, it is a little bit different and it's based on different legends, and they are starting to interpret it a little bit differently, but it is present there. We can see evidences and conversations of different examples of people thinking that the world was over at different points in biblical history. I'm sure during the flood in Noah's day, people thought that the world was over. And now that could have been an entire climate change incident. We don't really know. I mean, that obviously there is enough legend and lore across the ancient world to tell us that something happened. And so there's a lot of different detail in there, is that apocalypticism can literally fit into anything. It can fit into any narrative. We understand it very limited in a biblical context and in a Christian context. And it's basically society's going to deteriorate and there's going to be this moral decay. And then this guy's going to rise up and he's going to be the Antichrist and he's going to rule the whole world and the church is going to get raptured out and yada, yada, yada. In the Catholic Church, the apocalypticism, which the Catholic Church does not really have a very official end times teaching like dispensationalists do, but they have Marian apparitions that sound an awful lot like the Left Behind series, or maybe some of it's even more horrifying. They talk about 3 days of total darkness and when the sun won't shine for 3 days. And I remember something about gravitational pulls, and that, these people basically believe that Mary is appearing in kind of a phantom form and giving them these different messages about the end of the world. And so there is an apocalyptic tradition. It's a little bit more folk based, like I've told you about the folk concept in Catholicism. But like there was the prophecies of St. Malachy, and it's Malachy. He was an Irish church something. I don't know what he was. I want to say he was a bishop, but I'm not positive about that. And he predicted that there would only be so many popes and they were represented by symbols. And according to that, I think they said that the pope after John Paul II would be the last pope, and so that was Benedict XVI, which then means that already didn't happen. And there's a lot of speculations around the prophecies of St. Malachy that they might have been political, that they might have been written after the fact, that they were made to fit things that they didn't fit. Nostradamus. I mean, now, Nostradamus's predictions. Nostradamus was an occultist. He was not a prophet. And his quatrains can apply to just about anything. I mean, people try to make them fit all these different little things, but they could fit a lot of things. It's not specific enough. So apocalypticism is an outlook. It's not necessarily a doctrine or associated with one singular doctrine. Liberals are as susceptible to the thinking as conservatives, even if one is more overtly dogmatic than the other. So you can be apocalyptic without a whole lot of dogma. And I think that that's where people get hung up, is just because you've got people who have kind of set everything up in a certain light doesn't necessarily mean that other people can't have parts of that without all that heavy doctrine associated with it. So just because they don't care about the Bible doesn't mean they still don't have an apocalyptic outlook. Um, though the issues may American we process information very poorly. We just don't have good reading comprehension. And then we have a very poor understanding of one, biblical topics, two, the way faith overlaps with real time, and three, general matters that are commonly discussed that weren't years ago, such as science and scientific research. Like, for example, people thinking that the aliens are going to take us over. That would be an example of that. All right, but is this new? Okay, believe it or not, moral panic over the end of the world has been a pervasive thing for thousands of years. So let's talk a little bit about the end of the world. So predictions about the end of the world have been made since around 66 AD. And the first community that did it were the Essenes. Now, who can tell me who the Essenes are?
We're tiny little bitty community in, is it the Dead Sea? Yes, who are just like, we're gonna make Rome fall.
Yeah, right, all by themselves, exactly. And what did they write that was very important historically? Yes. Okay. Chuck gets a sticker. Okay. I'll go get you one when I'm done. Okay. So they predicted an uprising against the Romans in 66 to 70 AD, and there actually was an uprising, and they fell to Rome. So aren't we all shocked to learn that? I mean, it's like we look at history, we go, "Are you for real?" Okay. Well, but people, it's not any different than these guys running around playing army in the desert thinking that the United States government's coming to take their guns. It's like, yeah, you're going to withstand the United States government and the army. Okay, when the U.S. Army comes for you, you're going to be able to withstand that. Got it. Okay, so the reasons for predicting the end of the world include diverting attention from actual problems in society at times, such as war or poverty or other economics or other things that exist, pushing political agendas and promoting hatred of certain groups. So throughout history, anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim ideology has always been very, very key in predicting the end of the world. So like that was actually very relevant, as you guys know, from Middle Church history. Anti-Semitism was a very, very big thing. And so if you create a certain narrative around that, then you have a whole doctrine that sounds smart or religious or spiritual, but is actually just you hating on some group. And that even happens now. If you listen to a lot of QAnon or you listen to a lot of their theories, which that has an entire apocalyptic spin on it. That's not biblical. I mean, but it has messianic implications. In other words, they believe Trump has to have a second term because he's going to bring all the satanic child pedophile Kabbalah ring of. Yeah, it's kind of like Pizzagate. Yeah, it's related to Pizzagate. I think Pizzagate was somebody else. But yeah, in other words, they believe that the world is going to end because Trump's got to do this and he's going to bring all these people to justice. And then they're going to usher in the era of peace and everyone's going to know that Trump was right. And so that's a very messianic narrative. That's a narrative that's extraordinarily messianic. But instead of Jesus being there making things right or the Essene community fighting the Roman government, they have a Cheeto guy. So, I mean, go and figure. So you also have it rise because people feel powerless to create solutions. So, like, for example, during COVID, people felt very powerless. And then you have that the government imposed different restrictions, and that made people feel even more powerless. And so then that led to other things. A fascination with fear or romanticism of end times due to contemporary fiction, whether it's The Day After Tomorrow or 28 Days Later. I'm trying to think of apocalyptic movies. I don't really watch them. 2012. Oh, seriously?
I've seen it in the comedy section in like Target.
I've never seen it. Okay, I never saw it. Okay, or some of these movies. One of the first movies that was ever made was in, I think, in the 50s, and it was called Rapture. and it was supposed to be this dramatic look about the rapture, which is where all of those movies kind of have a similar theme, where a lot of people get their narration for the end times is from those movies. Um, a Thief in the Night was another one that was that was from the 70s. Nowadays, we would probably watch it and think it was hysterical. What was wrong with this? This is so stupid. They print little barcodes on everybody's head that's zeros and ones. I mean, it was just the weirdest thing ever. But, we kind of romanticize it. You've got the guy who's going to save the world from the meteor hitting, and he's got a bus, and he's going to drive really fast in it and outdrive the meteor to the spot. And we forgot Armageddon. Okay, Armageddon, or right. So like that, or some of these different things. A bus is going to save the world from the asteroid if he angles it just right, and the glass is tempered, and it just happens to be a tempered glass bus. I mean, and there's a girl, and she's kissing him goodbye. And think about the romantic notions. Like, I remember when COVID first hit, and we all said, gee, I thought the zombie apocalypse was going to be way more fun than us hoarding toilet paper and not following directions. And, this isn't fun, and prices going up. I mean, everybody was like, but think about some of these different ideas. There's a lot of romantic ideas surrounding the end of the world, like it's going to be a big adventure plot, or that it's going to be this whole thing. So approximately 14% of the world's population believes the world will end in their lifetime. I figured it would be higher than that. Most believe the cause will be nuclear war. Experts, and whatever they're experts of, I don't know. I think that ought to really clear, because I did read an article. I don't know what they're experts of. Believe that it's going to be due to AI. I have edited for AI. I have edited for ChatGPT. It is not going to be AI. It's just not. Okay, so 1 to 3% of the population thinks it will be caused by zombies or other alien invasion. And 16% of Americans believe it will be due to the Last Judgment. So there it is. So let's talk about things that are not actually new, but are kind of related to the end of the world. So the first thing I have listed here is climate change. Now, I have to thank you for sending me all that stuff. And, let's just start out here. So back in the 90s, recycling and ecology was new. I remember the first time I saw the news lead in before Full House, and I know it was Full House because I used to tape it because I liked Full House, saying recycling is now the law. And that was in New York State, and that was like 1990, 1991, somewhere around there that would have become actual law. And we were inundated with everything environmental. It was like nobody had ever really thought that much about it. And there was a lot of push to, quote unquote, save the environment and save the planet. And we all remember Captain Planet and the Planeteers, which was actually really kind of cute. And we remember all this sort of stuff. But there was a lot of things that they very much attributed to being the fault of the average person. So you had the greenhouse effect, and that the hole in the ozone was because of all these women wearing Aquanet in the 80s with the hairspray. Now, forget the fact that plenty of men did their hair like that too. That was a look with the metal hair, the glam metal, and all that. But Aquanet caused the hole in the ozone, and people not recycling. If we didn't recycle, it was going to ruin the whole world, and there was all this stuff. And so everybody basically was given stuff to do, and ecology was very, very personal. It was very, very private. It was like, we have to do all this stuff right now. And in this era, as I've already talked about stuff from this era, we already thought the world was going to end. We already thought the world was going to end as we watched the Waco compound in flames on the TV with the ATF going on and debating who set that fire. And we already thought, as we watched parts of California, of Los Angeles light up because of the Rodney King riots, we already thought the world was ending. So my mom felt so responsible for this, and so guilty that we couldn't recycle certain things because, and there's still things you were saying we still really can't recycle, okay? We had a whole shelf in the cupboard full of mugs with plastic spoons in them. Anytime we got a plastic spoon, got ice cream and it came with a spoon, would take them home. Like, let's say we were out, you would take them home. And we had them there because they couldn't be recycled. And then it was straws. So this cupboard is full of all this stuff. And it was to the point where my sister said, my mom was like, well, but we have to put them in the earth. And my sister said, so we're going to just keep them forever. Like that, and she had a point, because in other words, we're just going to have to keep everything because there isn't anything else to do with them. Now let's consider, we didn't create them. We didn't create this industry. This wasn't something that was really technically our responsibility, but they made it our responsibility. They made it the responsibility of the consumer. And at the time, there weren't alternatives. They didn't have those stupid paper spoons that, melt the second you put them in your mouth, or, those straws that disintegrate the second you put them in the drink. I mean, or the irony that they give you a paper straw in a plastic wrapper. Okay, I mean, they gave us the responsibility for the economy, or for the ecology, not considering the economy involved and all of the economy involved in plastics. And now we find down the line, all these years later, that only a very small percentage of all that stuff that we're hauling off to go be recycled because it's law, and because people felt serious about it, was ever even being used or recycled, because that was affecting the plastics industry and they didn't want to lose the money. So let's talk about climate change in this. Like we say, we were made to believe that it was our entire thing, like the entirety of the world hinged on us. But this is the fact. Science has proven climate change is affected by a number of different factors. It is not just one thing, including volcanic eruptions. Volcanic eruptions is one of the worst factors in climate change. And we cannot control volcanic eruptions. Okay, moving on.
Anyway.
So what happens is they change the temperatures in the atmosphere. They block the sun. And it changes the way that things are affected in the overall atmosphere. I mean, and I'm not going to explain that. I am not a scientist, but that's what it is. The Earth's elliptical orbit changes around the sun every so many years, and it has to do with distance. And it's a scientific fact. It's something that's there. Things like droughts, floods, and human factors all contribute to different changes relating to climate change throughout history. So it's not just caused by humans. That's not to say that we shouldn't do our part. It's not to say that we should not be conscientious of the things that we do. I'm not saying don't recycle. I'm not saying we shouldn't have cleaner air and water. And I'm not saying that these companies have the right to dump in all our resources, because I don't feel that they do. But where is the point when they get addressed instead of us getting addressed? And there is also economic disparity in climate change, whereas, for example, over 192 private jets a day go out of different airports in the world. Private jets that have one or two people on them and maybe a staff to take care of them. But I'm not supposed to take the car to go get groceries to the grocery store because that's climate change inducing. Somebody's not telling us the truth. Go tell the millionaires to go walk to the store. Or bike. Or go do something. Or Uber. You go tell them to, or take the bus. Yeah, or Heelys. So like we say, there's nothing wrong with producing ecological responsibility, but the burden of climate change does not rest on the average consumer. And I really think that that's proven that down the line, we're worse off than we were 30 or 40 years ago when we have all these things like recycling and we have all these different programs. And now they're taking them away. Like the city of Gastonia dropped it because people were putting stuff in they shouldn't, or were having to throw too much of it out and they didn't want to be bothered anymore. Societies that did not adjust to climate change often collapse. And I think that that's the point of climate change we're not focusing on. Everybody's trying to stop it, rather than maybe look at how do we survive through it or how do we go through some of it or kind of deal with some of it. So then you also have that every so many years nations fall apart, political parties are viewed in a different light, and power changes hands. So no matter who's in office, power shifts are inevitable. It's something that happens every so many years. And there are a number of different family or social structural changes throughout the world. Concepts of family, relationships, society, and yes, even gender have changed throughout history. And they vary often based on the environment that people live in or the circumstances that people live with. Like you pointed out, with that thing with the sociologists and the scientists and the hunter gatherers. Well, of course, women were not just all sitting around waiting for some big, strong man to come kill them a deer. If there wasn't anybody around and they were hungry, they would go find it themselves. It was like when they pushed for those all protein dog foods, and you said, of course, they ate grains. A deer did not always happen to walk by. And so we keep trying to model things according to our cultural ideals that are not necessarily accurate. So media influence, does the media want us well informed or to keep coming back for more? So let's talk about this for a minute. Programming with apocalyptic themes sells because it's adrenaline boosting. If it bleeds, it leads. And so it taps into the human fascination with the unknown, the drama and fantasy of the end of time, and that people are easily absorbed into such programming. If it bleeds, it leads. And many people believe such programming, especially among younger generations, provides a very bleak outlook, one without a future or hope of a future. And if you think about that, that now we've got a couple of generations that have come up almost exclusively with that. Let's look at Gen Alpha. Let's look at Gen Z. They are very much the product of that bleakness. The way the future is portrayed in media consumes influences it demands purchasing panic and the way we view our own futures. Adrenaline pumping programming gets more views and more long-term viewers than that does not. And so, like the new technology feeds our fears, so like the AI developments, it's like I say, I don't even know how much further AI is going to wind up going, having worked with it, having been on the other side of it. I don't know really where it can go. You can only program it to do so many things. It's not a human being. And it cannot make judgment calls and read certain things based on stuff because it does not have that cognition. And even though the media may not take a religious view, they're quick to promote articles, interviews, and stories about people of religious persuasions who believe the end of the world is nigh, make various predictions about it, or who take certain postures about it for the sake of views in media advertising. Harold Camping. How many times that Christian Family Radio guy who actually died a few years ago predicted the end of the world. They were handing out pamphlets in New York City. They always pay attention. There was a guy way before y'all's time. His name was Herbert Armstrong. He got a lot of media attention. He was from advertising, and he predicted the end of the world 5 or 6 times. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how the ancients viewed time. So let's first of all understand that they had basically 3 different understandings of the divisions of the world. So you had the Bereshit. Bereshit means in the beginning, or it's the first word that you find in the Old Testament. So in the book of Genesis, the book opens with Bereshit. So that's the creation to the flood. That's in the beginning. Okay. Then we've got what we call the Olam Hasek. The Olam Hasek would be the present world. So it's the flood, which is basically kind of like the earth being born again to the present day. And time operates in that by cycles. Okay. And they're marred by evil and sin. It's not a timeline, but it's basically these different ways that power changes hands. Sometimes things are good, sometimes things are bad. People are moral, people are amoral. In this never-ending cycle, and it trades off. Sometimes it's at the same time, sometimes it's at differing times. Yeah, it's a loop-de-loop. Yep. Exactly. Yep. Which when you read it, if you really take the time to read it, because I mean, I'm the first one to admit the idea of it's not that interesting. You're just sitting there reading a bunch of things. But when you start getting into how the same cycles kept repeating over and over again, you understand how they wound up in captivity. Okay. What? Exactly. So throughout the present world, there will be a number of different ebbs and flows, different times and ideas by which humanity will shift. So then there's the concept called the Tikkun Olam, which literally means the repair of the world. And that has a lot of different understandings, particularly if you look at modern Judaism and the way that they interpret it. It's interpreted a lot of different ways. So it's often understood as the cessation of idolatry, which that fits given everything we've been studying. But in a biblical sense, Acts 3:21 talks about the process of all things one day being restored. So in combination with the world to come, or Revelation 17 and 18, where it talks about the fall of Babylon. In other words, the fall of the idolatry, the fall of the system. And so what I would kind of say is that it's kind of the idea of the end times. That in other words, you have a period of time, and so like we would understand the repair of the world starting with Calvary, and then the work of Christ, and then kind of lasting through until the time when Christ returns. That would be kind of the Christian interpretation of it. And in the middle, the church has the opportunity to help in the repair of the world, or the healing of the world. And then there's Olam Haba, which means the world to come, or the new world, which means the world would be restored, returning all things to God, people in order as they were in the beginning. So this is how the ancients viewed the world. In the beginning, you had the Garden of Eden, you had God, you had people, and you had order. In the end, you're going to have God, you're going to have people, and you're going to have the order. And in the middle, you have that sorting out process of the fall and on. So in biblical terminology, understanding the term like day of the Lord, or the term day, literally can mean a non-specific period of time. That's why when you get the literal creationists and they say creation happened literally in 7 days, that's not actually a really biblical understanding. That term day could be 1,000 years, it could be 1,000,000 years, it could be an indefinite period of time. And then you've got an eon, which is the Greek term, and it actually literally means a space of time and age, or a cycle of time. So the idea of the world ending as we know it is literally what it means. It's not literally that every single thing on earth is going to end, but it literally means that there is a cycle, or a time, or a period in which things are kind of moving towards a different direction. And as we understand it, let's get a couple of things straight. So the ancients saw the end of the world as a prophetic period that would last from the current age until the time when the restoration of all things happens. So like we would say, some people might call it the church era, or the church age. And so it's been going on from the beginning. It was not possible to be a Christian in the first century and not be apocalyptic, because that was the hype that was there. But their apocalypticism was different than ours. And we'll talk about that in a second. So it was noted as a period of tumult. So the birth pangs, the idea of that it talks about, because it signified the end of a systematic cycle and the transition into a new era. And then you have that it was not a specified length of time. There was no promise of 7 years. There was no promise of 3.5 years. That's all been done by people in modern times through charting, and that we'll discuss next. And the early church saw this end times period as the church age. So we've said that, and the existing worldly systems would basically hold everything up, and things would dismantle, and then in place God's kingdom would be established forever. So going back to that beginning. So how did they not see the end of the world? And this is kind of important. They did not see it from a dispensational perspective. Any perspective that requires biblical literacy, they didn't have in the first century. They didn't have the Bible. They couldn't piece together theories on Daniel and Revelation and bridge them. They couldn't, and there's a lot more than just Daniel in the book of Revelation. That's a whole other point. If it's dependent on your ability to read and make a little chart and calculate dates and times, that's not how they would have believed it in the first century. It's not to say some of the beliefs don't maybe overlap in spots, because maybe they do. Maybe they came to some similar conclusions. But dispensationalism, and that's up there, they would not have done timeline charts because that's not how they saw things. They saw cycles. They didn't see, all I wake up tomorrow, and then in 30 days from now, it'll be the calculation of 3,250 years since this happened, and then the world is going to end, which is basically what a lot of these theories are. No, it would have been possible. And to put our time into their time also doesn't fit, because they had different times and calendars and things of that. So America is not even a dot on the map in Bible predictions. So to say that because America's falling somehow means that everything is falling, that's a nope. The invasion of modern technology, there were no prediction of robots, AI, or any zombies, any of that in biblical times. It just was not a thing. And perhaps the major statement is that they just didn't see the world through a modern narrative. And anytime we keep trying to see the ancient world through a modern narrative, it's going to wind up inaccurate. It's just not the way that they put it. So is the world ending right now? And I guess what I would say is that I think that it is the end of the world as we know it. And I think that that happens every so many generations. I think it happens every so many cycles. Things are changing. The world ends for us, but it starts again. And I think it's going to be this way because I think God wants us to adopt an understanding of more prophetic time. I think that our trying to cram things into a modern timeline just doesn't really work in eternity. We're supposed to be just understanding to eternity, not to try and cram everything into a modern timeline and think everything is going to happen. And so things change, they start again, they're renewed, they stop, they become something else. It's all part of the world. And ultimately, come the end, God will be the only thing that's going to stand. That's the point, that the kingdom will be forever. We need to check sources of information rather than running with everything. And you have really taught me to look up everything. Everything, even the stuff we think sounds okay, even stuff everywhere. And so we need to consider that some of what we're told isn't always for accuracy, but for the sake of selling something or believing something. Consumerism sells. And make the commitment to understand biblical terminology and concept rather than jumping on every idea. And I think that this is kind of how it summarizes for me, is this quote. And that's who said it. And I don't want to totally butcher the name. I don't pay attention to the world ending. It has ended for me many times and began again in the morning. But thank you for coming to my TED Talk.